You're very privileged to have him in the room today. He has abandoned his mathematics career as a PhD in math. You know, I stopped at my bachelor's. He got his master's, PhD, and worked with some highly intelligent men. Very competent man. He's abandoned all of that because he knows that critical race theory is out to destroy America, to destroy the church, and destroy the world. And someone has to stop it, and he's devoted his life to stopping it. And I'd like you to welcome Dr. James Lindsay.
Thank you, Bob. Now I have to live up to that. I love these introductions. I have to live up to them. Everything he said, especially about me, is true. That much I can tell you. But no, this truly is America's darkest hour, and this is truly the fight of our lives, the fight of our generations, the fight of the generation that is being indoctrinated in our schools, even though they don't know it yet. They're not old enough to know it yet. And that means we've got to raise them right. As it turns out, by the way, critical race theory and all the rest of these critical theories are, in fact, in the schools. You might hear some lies about that on the television, or you might hear some lies about that from your school board, or from the principal, or from the superintendent, or from who knows who in any official capacity. But it turns out it is in the schools. It hides itself under different names. And so yesterday when I spoke at OakPack, we opened with an invocation, and the first thing that was prayed for was discernment. So I want to mention that first. In order to take on any of these Marxian theories that are derived from the ideas of Marx, you need discernment. They all play the same game. They create a fictional, false reality out of language, and they force people to play as though that false reality is real. That's how they work. They tell you that racism in critical race theory, for example, doesn't mean what you think it means. It means this complicated systemic thing. They say that systemic racism is the racism that occurs even if nobody's racist. Even if nobody's racist, even if no institution is racist, it's the racism that still occurs. Because outcomes don't come out the same. There must be racism. That's exactly how it works. They tell you that diversity means people who look different but all think the same. They tell you that inclusion means excluding certain ideas and certain people. They tell you that equality is not enough, we need equity instead. I don't know if you know the definition of equity. I'm going to be giving a talk about equity specifically soon in Florida, and so looking into it, one of the original papers on equity was written in 1968 by a man named H. George Fredrickson, and he explained that the difference between equality and equity is very simple. He said that equality is when citizens A and B are equal. Equity is when we adjust shares so that we make citizens A and B equal. They don't mean the same thing. That's redistribution. They play linguistic games there too. It's a little bit out of what I want to speak to you about today to point it out, but they play the game there with what does access mean. They say we're not doing equality of outcomes, we're doing equality of access. But the way you know if equality of access was achieved is if there are equal outcomes. So they keep screwing around with the system to change the access until the outcomes are equal. So they're just doing equality of outcomes. This is why discernment is necessary to cut through the ideas of critical race theory or critical gender theory, its twin, queer theory, gender theory's derivative. Some of the scarier stuff that's happening in the schools is coming out of queer theory. We won't talk too much about that today, but queer is defined as an identity without an essence. In other words, it's a way to indoctrinate children into having identity crises. Why would you do that? Because people who don't know who they are don't know how to stand for anything. People who don't know who they are easy to manipulate. People who don't know who they are easy to radicalize, to make miserable, and to then put to the uses of tearing apart a society. That's your children. That's their agenda with your children. Same thing with critical race theory. The agenda with critical race theory is the only agenda of critical race theory is to raise what is known as racial consciousness. Racial consciousness is a direct parallel of Marx's idea of class consciousness. You are to become aware that certain races are oppressors and others are oppressed. There's to be a conflict across that class division, what social scientists call a stratification, by a systemic power dynamic that they name white supremacy, which is pervasive throughout all of society, which all white people benefit from. There's a scholar by the name of, I use the word scholar with my tongue firmly in my cheek, by the name of Barbara Applebaum, who wrote a book in 2010 called Being White, Being Good. And Barbara Applebaum is a horrific woman. And she explained that what white privilege is about is a set of benefits that are not easily renounced. She then explains that all white people are therefore complicit in racism, whether they want to be or not. She explicitly says in the book more than 10 times that all white people are in fact racist. She quotes another scholar saying that white people depend on that racial superiority for the very understanding of their being. This is what critical race theory wants to teach your children. This has roots. We could talk about the historical roots. This didn't come out of the ground when George Floyd died. I like to tell people that. It didn't come out of the ground when everybody decided that Donald Trump was racist. Somebody told me recently that he's the only president in living memory who was scapegoated for his skin color. It turns out orange is not okay. But there you go. I thought that was funny. I don't know if it's true. But this has deep historical roots. We could talk about the master-slave dialectic all the way back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau before the French Revolution, which didn't go very well. We could talk about how Hegel imported the master-slave dialectic and based his entire systematic philosophy, which is to say his worldly systematic theology, on the master-slave dialectic. We can say how Marx adapted Hegel's dialectic to create what he calls dialectical materialism, which is how the contradictions of the material conditions of the world are to reveal to the working class how they're oppressed and to generate that class consciousness of their exploitation, of their alienation from the fruits of their labor, how their surplus value is being stolen by the capitalists, to create bourgeois property that they don't properly and truly own. That same class consciousness, that same conflict across that line of division, bourgeois versus proletariat, is reproduced in critical race theory. Whiteness becomes the bourgeois property. In 1993, we have a scholar named Cheryl Harris who wrote a paper titled Whiteness is Property. Wow. Characterized whiteness as a form of property, giving it the exact same legal status as property rights like your home or your car. And the most important of those is the right to exclude. That white people created the white race and the other races specifically to exclude other people from the full benefits of society, which 200 years ago was true, which as of about 55 years ago is not true and hasn't been true, and is something virtually every decent, free person in the world has rejected for most or all of their lives. What they want to do is raise this race consciousness to create a new proletariat out of, as Herbert Marcuse, a famous Marxist from the 60s, phrased it, the ghetto population. How do you raise up that vital energy, as he said, the vital needs of the ghetto population and channel them into a revolutionary movement consistent with Marx's vision? You indoctrinate college students, he said, to minister to them the critical theory. And if that critical theory is based in race rather than class, it's critical race theory. The person who named critical race theory is a woman named Kimberly Crenshaw. She was a doctoral student at Harvard Law under Derek Bell, who also is considered the co-founder of critical race theory. She named it in 1989. She explained the choice of the name critical race theory by saying, well, we were critical theorists who were interested in racial justice. We were racial justice advocates who did critical theory. Critical theory is the name of the engine of neo-Marxism, which is the reinvention of Marxism that we had in the middle part of the century. So she's openly saying that critical race theory was the natural name for what she's doing because it's rooted in Marxist theory. So if you didn't know for sure that it's Marxist, and I can put the last nails in this coffin as deep as you want them, one after another, after another, after another, after another, there you go. Another quick anecdote to that founding conference where it got its name, Critical Race Theory, we had a man named Richard Delgado, who, if I get the time, I will read you a little bit from him. And Richard Delgado explained in the 90s, I was at that foundational conference, he said we had it in a convent off the University of Wisconsin at Madison campus. Said it was an austere room, stained glass, crucifixes here and there, a strange setting for a bunch of Marxists. And among the people he named with him as that bunch of Marxists, he named that same Kimberly Crenshaw that I just mentioned, among others. So when Kimberly Crenshaw goes on TV, as she did a couple of months ago, excuse me, on Joy Reid's show on MSNBC, and gets asked point blank, is this Marxist? And she says, well, what you have to understand is it's a way of viewing the world. She never says, yes, it's Marxist. She never says it. It's a way of viewing the world. What kind of way of viewing the world? P.S. It's Marxist. In 1995, just to kind of bring this a little bit further in, we have a paper written by Gloria Ladson Billings and William Tate titled Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education. Why they wrote a paper called Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education in 1995, if it wasn't going to be in schools by 2021, 26 years later, who knows? Why that's been 26 years of Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education, but it's somehow not in schools, who knows? Mysteries of critical race theory. This is why discernment is necessary. And in that paper, she said that the point of critical race theory is to make race the central construct for understanding inequality.
Right.
That's it. So we're going to replace class, which is the Marxist way of thinking about inequality, material conditions being unequal, with now a broader panorama, material conditions, social conditions, cultural conditions. The invention in the early 2000s of what they call cultural racism, which is what happens when you have two different cultures, say white culture and so-called black culture, whatever these things are, and they have different outcomes. Must be cultural racism. So they invent new kinds of racism to keep racism on life support because they don't have the regular kind anymore. And so in 2003, just one more nail in that coffin, if we will. There's a fellow named Charles Mills, who is the chief conspiracy theorist of critical race theory, if you ask me. He wrote a book in the 90s titled The Racial Contract, where he explains that all white people are participating in a social contract to uphold white supremacy and their own dominance, even though nobody ever tells them about it. Nobody ever speaks about it openly. Most people don't even know it exists. But this is how racism really works, that there's a secret social contract to keep whites dominant and keep everybody else down. He went on in 2003 to write a book titled From Class to Race, where he explains how critical race theorists shifted the focus out of class and into race, but maintained Marxist theories otherwise. It's that simple. That's what we're dealing with. This is a Marxist attempt on our country. The Marxists have known for 100 years that the softest and weakest spot in the American fabric, if we look at the flag, the place where the loosest thread is race. And they knew that if they could get a hold of that thread the right way and pull that thread hard enough, that they could take the flag apart, could rip our society apart, make room for Marxism to come in, make room for communism in the United States, which has been their goal for over a century. So this is not a new problem. This is not a new phenomenon. They've been cooking up these ideas. Since the 60s, they knew, with the ghetto populations of Herbert Marcuse, that they knew that they had to get into racial minority groups and to channel their anger, which in the 60s was certainly largely justified. Channel that not into the civil rights movement led by people like Martin Luther King, but rather into Marxist resentment. This is exactly consistent with all of the Marxist theory and thinking of the 1960s and 1970s. How do we channel the existing resentment? Is that in these colonized areas? How do we get the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong? How do we channel their resentment into a communist front? How do we take the racial and sexual minorities throughout the West and channeled their resentment into a Marxist front? How do we take people, children, now I'm referring to Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which took over our teaching colleges in the 1980s, by the way. All of our teachers for almost 40 years have been educated by a Marxist teaching manual. Nearly all. You wonder how our society has got where it is. We ceded the colleges of education to the Marxists in the 1980s, almost 40 years ago. That's how. Almost every teacher in this country has been trained in Marxist ideology, and in that book he says the peasants will realize their dependency. But does he say how to get out of that dependency? Does he say to lean into responsibility, personal responsibility, to take command of your life, to educate yourself, to lift yourself up, to form a stable community around yourself that can make those conditions control that small area around you and grow that way? No. He says we need Marxist solidarity. We need to teach these disaffected people to hate their society and to want to tear it down for something new. And that something new is what Herbert Marcuse in the same decade described as certain historical possibilities that have become regarded as utopian possibilities, which is a lot of damn words to say communism. It's how he talks, by the way. I read his book, One Dimensional Man, 3 times through before I realized that every time he uses the word the enemy, he's talking about communism. He talks in these weird phrases, so you never quite know what he's talking about. They all do this. Discernment is necessary. How does he call communism, if he's a communist, the enemy? Because that's what the Americans call it. So he's using it ironically, sardonically, sarcastically. Oh, the great enemy this, the great enemy that. It took me 3 times to read that book. I'm pretty smart. 3 times to read that book to figure out the enemy equals communism. So it's so hard to read these people and understand what they're talking about. And that's true in critical race theory as well. So I want to read a little bit. I don't like to mischaracterize people, and I think it's very helpful if we actually hear them in their own words, and I got to figure out which finger opens my phone. Might have to actually do the code. Yep. I don't know which finger opens my phone, apparently. So I want to read to you a couple of things to give you an idea of this level of discernment, but also to make clear to you what critical race theory is and what it stands for. So I'm going to read to you, like I said, from Richard Delgado. I think it's very important. If you are willing and interested in taking on this fight in a significant way, where you're going to take the fight to critical race theory, you're going to have to learn critical race theory. You're going to have to bite the bullet and learn this stuff. You're going to have to learn how they manipulate language. If you don't want to do that, that's great. There's still lots for you to do. You can play a support role. You can be a good neighbor. You can reach out to friends. You can be somebody who just whispers or speaks loudly and boldly that you don't believe in this, so that people know they're not alone. There are a lot of things you can do. But if you want to take the fight, you've got to learn some of this. And the best way to learn it is to actually not listen to people like me, but to read it yourself. And luckily, this Critical Race Theory and Introduction, written by Richard Delgado in 2001, is 20 years ago. Luckily, it was written at the high school level, because it's not in schools. That's why you would write a high school level textbook on the subject in 2001, because it's not going to be in schools. Before I do that, though, I want to just point out, I mentioned diversity, I mentioned inclusion, I mentioned equity, I mentioned racism, and how they all have specialized definitions. Hundreds of words that critical race theory uses have specialized definitions. I want to tell you actually that the words critical race theory themselves, those 3 words, have specialized definitions, and a lot of people don't realize that. So let's start with critical. Critical, you think, might mean being skeptical, asking for evidence. What are your reasons? I'm not sure about that. Let's take a critical look at this. Let's make sure we're right before we proceed. It carries all of that with it. That's what we think. Critical thinking. It's very important. We need to be critical in how we think about race. In a paper from 2017 in a prominent philosophy journal called Hypatia, it is the leading feminist philosophy journal, whatever that's worth. P.S. Not much. Allison Bailey wrote a paper in that journal called Tracking Privilege-Preserving Epistemic Pushback in Critical Race and Feminist Philosophy Classrooms. Privilege-preserving epistemic, I can't even say it. George Carlin had a bit about this. He says bad words, but you should watch it, where they put the hyphens and the extra syllables. Privilege-preserving epistemic pushback is the idea that people don't disagree with critical race theory or feminism for legitimate reasons. They do so to maintain their privilege. They have no legitimate reason to disagree. They just want to stay privileged. They want to keep their access to privilege, whether it's by virtue of their skin or by virtue of the benefits that they get by selling their cultural souls to the white man. There's no valid way. And in that paper, she explains that there's a difference between the critical thinking tradition and the critical theory tradition. The word critical means something different in both of those two contexts. In the critical thinking tradition, she explains we care about what she says epistemic adequacy, knowing what we're talking about. Soundness of argument, validity of argument, weight of evidence. Those are the things she mentions. That's critical thinking. Not jumping to conclusions, asking for better reasons and better evidence and better arguments before we make a conclusion. Questioning where we might be wrong. That's critical thinking. Critical theory, she says, on the other hand, comes from a different set of assumptions rooted in the neo-Marxist tradition. Its focus is not on epistemic adequacy, but the role power plays in shaping knowledge. Therefore, if you accept those premises, I don't. If you accept those premises, the only reason you might disagree is not because you think it's wrong, that would be epistemic adequacy, but because you want to maintain power. That's her conclusion. That's the depth of this mud puddle. So critical means using critical theory, which is the derivation of Marxist theory as it came down through the 1930s, through the 1960s, and going forward. I'll skip race. I'll read that one to you in a minute. You'll be shocked. Hold your breath. Theory means Marxist theory. It doesn't mean scientific theory. In my book, Cynical Theories, I see a few on the tables. We took pains to capitalize the T in theory so that people would understand that it's something different than scientific theory. Marxist theory is what I've already explained, this idea that the society, as they say, is stratified into power versus oppressed, and that there's a conflict across that, and the point is to raise the consciousness of the oppressed so that they will band together in solidarity to create a dictatorship of the proletariat, or now of the anti-racists, overthrow the existing power structure, install themselves, and usher us through a managed state called socialism until it finally, get this, dissolves itself, realizes the state power is no longer necessary to maintain the dictatorship, and spontaneously becomes a stateless, classless society called communism. They really do think that that's going to happen. That if you just give them all the power, eventually nobody will need power anymore. The names for these things are not socialism and communism and critical race theory, they are racial equity and racial justice. If we give the anti-racists like Ibram Kendi with his constitutional amendment all the power to decide what is and is not racist at every level, then he'll manage a state of racial equity where we adjust shares until people are made equal across racial divides. And if we do this long enough, finally all of the sins of history, past, present, and future, will be amended, and we will enter into a state of racial justice that nobody can describe because they don't know what it looks like. Because communists never know what it's going to look like. In fact, their literature says you cannot describe the utopia in positive terms. It can only be cast in the negative. All we can do is point out the negative aspects of our society and complain about them. And then they say that the seeds of the utopia exist in the current society and will then grow out of the society in which they are contained. That's alchemy. That's not science. That's theory. Now, race. I won't prattle about that. I'll just read you the definition from Brandeis University's Social Justice Glossary website. This is actually, for the moment, I keep talking about it, so it'll probably get memory hold soon. It is still on the internet on Brandeis University's website. Race, a misleading and deceptively appealing classification of human beings created by white people originally from Europe, which assigns human worth and social status using the white racial identity as the archetype of humanity, for the purpose of creating and maintaining privilege, power, and systems of oppression. That's what they mean by race. It's not your skin color, it's not your ethnic heritage, it's not where you come from, it's not who your parents might have been, it's not who you happen to be. It is a misleading and deceptively appealing classification of human beings created by white people, originally from Europe, which assigns human worth and social status using the white racial identity as the archetype of humanity, specifically for the purpose of creating and maintaining privilege, power, and systems of oppression. That's crazy. That's not what people think When they say we're going to have an honest conversation about race, we're going to have a racial reckoning, or whatever the phrases that they use are, that's not what people think they mean by race. But that's what they mean by race. That's why discernment is necessary. And if you want to take this on, that's why reading their literature is necessary. Who would have known that? I told this to a lawyer recently, that works with a foundation that's taken several cases to the Supreme Court and won in the past. And I said, do you even know the definition of race that they use? And I showed this to her, with the source and everything. And she said, if judges knew this, it would be a much different story in court. It's a much different story. They're not using the words the way that people think they usually use the words. So now we can understand, when I read a little bit from Mr. Delgado, Dr. I guess Delgado, the bunch of Marxists. He wrote this book, Critical Race Theory and Introduction, in 2001. I have the first edition. It's been written again. It's in its third edition, 2017. It's largely the same. I've seen it. So I assume that they stand by what they said 20 years ago. What is critical race theory? This is the first two paragraphs of the book. I'll just read these to you so you can actually hear some critical race theory for yourself. The critical race theory movement is a collection of activists and scholars. Notice they put activists first. Interested in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. It's not about epistemic adequacy. It's about power. And we know that race means something full of power. The movement considers many of the same issues that conventional civil rights and ethnic studies discourses take up, but places them in a broader perspective that includes economics, history, context, group and self-interest, and even feelings and the unconscious. This is why it can read your mind. But I want to draw your attention to the fact that they say that it considers many of the same things that traditional civil rights does, but. Right? That but says everything. They go on to say, unlike traditional civil rights, which embraces incrementalism and step-by-step progress. So let me decode the Marxism for you here. Here's your discernment lesson of the day. If it's a movement that seeks to transform things without using increments and step-by-step, what do you think it's calling for? Thank you for saying it. That's right. Let's all say revolution together. It's a revolutionary movement. How Marxist. Yeah, revolution. So unlike traditional civil rights, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order. Let me pause for a second because I know that liberal is a watchword here in Oklahoma. It's not that liberal. It's that liberal. It's that liberal. It's Locke. It's Jefferson. It's Madison. It's Franklin. That liberal. The foundation of this country, the Constitution, the Declaration, the Bill of Rights. In fact, the Declaration says all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. What do critical race theorists say? Calls into question the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory. First thing they mention. Legal reasoning. That's your rule of law. No rule of law, no republic, folks. Enlightenment rationalism. That is your critical thinking. And the neutral principles of constitutional law. So both neutrality in interpreting the law and the idea of a constitutional republic. So when the Orange discriminated against president said this is an un-American ideology and was raked over the coals by the lying media for it, he was correct. Trump was right, turns out to be a thing. I say that as somebody who voted for Hillary Clinton and then sat on the floor in despair, like many of my left-leaning friends and colleagues in 2016. Orange man good. Lest there be any doubt. So that's the first charming paragraph under what is critical race theory. The second I'll read a little more quickly. Although CRT began as a movement in the law, it has rapidly spread beyond this discipline. Let me remind you, this was written 20 years ago. Today, many in the field of education consider themselves critical race theorists, but it's not in schools. It's weird, isn't it? Like all these education theorists just became critical race theorists over 20 years ago, but they never did anything in the schools with it? Wow. What a bunch of nice people. That's so realistic. I believe every word. What do? They use CRT's ideas to understand issues of school discipline and hierarchy. That's why no kids get disciplined anymore. They call it restorative justice, which was a concept that isn't totally without merit that they colonized and turned into this. So now our schools are actually the most dangerous that they've been in decades. It's very difficult to learn in environments where nobody gets disciplined. They also investigate tracking controversies over curriculum and history. There's your 1619 project. And IQ and achievement testing, and that's why the SAT is racist and we aren't supposed to have it anymore. What are you going to replace it with? Subjective assessments by Marxist teachers deciding who has the best party line. Yeah, that objective test that tells you your score, your ability in math and language, that's going to be replaced by how well you can satisfy your teacher that you understand the Marxist line. That's exactly what Mao did in China. He got rid of the standardized tests and replaced them with party tests in the schools and promoted party apparatchiks and commissars rather than competent, skilled people. Political scientists, he says, ponder voting strategies coined by critical race theorists. There's Stacey Abrams. Ethnic studies courses often include a unit on critical race theory, and American studies departments teach material on critical white studies developed by CRT writers. Now, this is a fine point, but as far as the lies go, you've been told probably, oh, that came from critical, if you've listened to the TV enough, that came from critical whiteness studies, not critical race theory. They're not the same thing. Well, according to critical race theory and introduction, they are the same thing. On second paragraph, by the way, of the book. And this is the kicker, and I'll stop with his book here. Unlike some academic disciplines, critical race theory contains an activist dimension. No kidding. It not only tries to understand our social situation, but to change it. Anybody know who he's paraphrasing there? So in the 1840s, a rather diabolical man said, hitherto philosophers have sought to understand the world, the point is to change it. That's what's being paraphrased. That philosopher's name is Karl Marx. Second paragraph of a high school level book in critical race theory openly paraphrases Karl Marx. I mentioned a few minutes ago, that was pages 2 and 3 of this book, by the way. I mentioned a few minutes ago that we were, all men are created equal, that's America, and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, as opposed to privileges granted by the state. You think that word is an accident, by the way, privilege? What do you think they're going to redistribute? They're going to seize privilege and redistribute it, just like they seized the means of production in classical Marxism to redistribute those. Seize privilege and redistribute it. Privilege is granted by the state. Yeah, this week you can gather, next week you can't. Yeah, you have to wear a mask. No, you don't. Yes, you do. Somebody's from California. I was just in California. I went to Orange County, and it was one world, and I went to LA County the next day, and it was a very different world. Privilege is granted by the state. But here in America, we have rights endowed by the Creator. What does this book say about rights? Page 23. Critical race theorists are highly suspicious. This is an exact quote, even though I'm not reading it. Highly suspicious of another liberal mainstay, namely rights. This is what they're teaching your children. Rights are something to be suspicious of. Freedom is something selfish and racist. Equality is inequality. How Orwellian. Neutrality is never neutral. The Constitution is racist. There's even on the National Archives now, if you don't know this, a warning that the language in those documents is sometimes offensive. On the website of the National Archives of the United States of America, this thing is at its greatest threat, at least since the Civil War and probably period. So I've only got a few minutes left. I think I've put the nail in the coffin that this thing's Marxist, in their own words. I think I've also convinced you that this is a serious problem. I've given you some hints about what you can do to take it on. The first thing you have to take it on is to realize it must be taken on. You can't sit this one out. I've been screaming into this hurricane by myself for a number of years. It's so encouraging now. I got asked the other day when I was in Wisconsin by a fella. He said, "What gives you hope?" And I said, "The American people." Because I go city to city to city to city. Oklahoma City yesterday, Tulsa today, Green Bay last week, Madison before that, Los Angeles before that, Orange County before that, just one place after another after another. And I see Americans saying, this is the fight of our lives, and we have to rise up to this. We have to reinstall these values, and we have to get those values back in our schools, and we have to protect and save our children. So what can you do? Luckily, I only have 2 minutes, and I don't have to dither in this too long. Like I said, you have to get involved locally if you want to take this on. You have to learn enough about it to be able to speak about it intelligently, to discern when they're manipulating language, that diversity doesn't mean diversity, that inclusion means exclusion, that race means something very different, that everything's imbued with this way of thinking and power dynamics. I promise you, I said mud puddle about this earlier. It is not deep. It's hard to learn at first because there's a lot of fancy jargon and language. This book I quoted from, you should read it. Delgado and Stefanczyk, Critical Race Theory and Introduction, written at the high school level. You can read it. You can read it 3 or 4 times and start to understand it because they write in this kind of junky language. Then you can show up and you can get involved in local politics. You can show up to your school board if you're a normal person. You can run for school board. You can get organized. This is the most organized state that I've come to in terms of people on the ground forming organizations, taking the fight to the institutions and trying to do something about it. All the other states have, some of the other states have, I think, more fire, but they don't have any organization. And Oklahoma is going to give you conduits to show up, to stand up, and to do something. What has to be done if you're taking the fight? If you're not, like I said, you've got to be the support staff. You've got to be somebody's ear. You've got to be able to hear people out. You've got to make friends. You've got to help people know they're not the only one against this. You have to be bold, not afraid of the consequences, to say, no, I disagree with this. This is actually evil. This is un-American. This is not what we're going to do here in Oklahoma. This is not what we're going to do in the United States. But if you're taking the fight, it's very simple. You have to get educated, you have to get organized, and you have to show up. That's the whole recipe. Well, step 4 is you have to win. That's all it takes. Network with each other. Join these organizations or support these organizations that are standing up against this. Connect the organizations together in a tight network where they're sharing information, sharing ideas, sharing manpower, sharing volunteers, sharing whatever it is that they share. Put this all together, then get organized with your information, show up in numbers, and take on a school board. One parent will get doxxed and name-called and shut down and yelled at. 100 parents is a real problem. 1,000 parents is a huge problem. And don't be afraid, by the way, I just heard from somebody who did some research into their school. So I said 1,000 parents. Imagine 1,000 parents served in a school district. It's not that hard to imagine. This person did some research and found out that their school district is being pushed around by exactly 5 activists. 5 controlling 1,000. That's actually what you're up against. Those are your odds. It's better than coronavirus. So, thank you for coming. Thank you for wanting to take this fight. Think carefully. Study if you want to take the fight. And if you don't want to study, I don't blame you. It's horrible. Network, become friends, support one another, hear people out, connect. Reject this everywhere. I'll close with a quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn from the Gulag Archipelago, where he described the failure of the people, in his own way of putting it, in the Soviet Republic. That's, I guess, an oxymoron. The USSR, anyway. To stand up. He said, this isn't the quote I wanted to share, but he actually did say, we didn't love freedom enough. We deserved everything that followed after. But the quote he said that I want to share with you is he said, this is the attitude you have to have. Let the lie come into the world. Let it triumph even, but not through me. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Oklahoma.